Step outside with your hands visible. Exit the residence now. We'll discuss paperwork outside. Show me the warrant.
They surrounded the wrong house, and the man standing barefoot in the doorway wasn't the frightened civilian they expected, but a retired Navy SEAL who understood pressure better than they ever would. Just after 1:07 a.m., the quiet cul-de-sac in Clearwater Ridge, Texas went from dead silent to blinding white as 3 unmarked SUVs rolled in fast, parking at hard angles that boxed in the driveway and flooded the front of the 2-story brick home with high beams and mounted lights, turning trimmed hedges and porch columns into sharp shadows against the siding. Doors opened in sequence, boots hit pavement, and voices followed immediately, loud and authoritative. Step outside with your hands visible. The command wasn't a request, it was a tactic, fast compliance before questions. But the front door opened only halfway, and Ethan Walker stepped into the threshold without crossing it, barefoot on hardwood, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, hands raised chest high where everyone could see them, palms open, fingers spread, posture square, no sudden movement, no defiance in his voice and no fear either. He didn't step onto the porch, didn't retreat back inside, didn't give them the shuffle that nervous people give under lights. He simply said, calm and controlled, "Show me the warrant. Confirm the address." The lead IC agent ignored the sentence entirely, repeating the command louder, trying to establish tempo. "Sir, exit the residence now. We'll discuss paperwork outside." That's how it works in high-pressure entries. Separate the occupant from cameras, from cover, from clarity. But Ethan didn't take the bait. He kept his hands exactly where they were and answered the same way. "No. Address verification first. I'm not stepping into floodlights surrounded by vehicles." Inside the foyer, just out of sight but close enough to project clearly, Maya Walker spoke without raising her voice. "Exterior cameras are recording. Doorbell camera is recording. Audio and video are active." And that statement shifted something subtle but important because it told the team this wasn't going to be summarized later in a way that favored momentum over fact. The lead agent pivoted tactics. "Provide identification," he demanded, as if Ethan owed immediate movement. But Ethan shook his head slightly, careful not to drop his hands. "I'm not reaching for anything under lights. Supervisor on scene. Warrant on camera. Then we proceed." The word obstruction was thrown out like a hook, meant to create narrative leverage, but Ethan didn't argue labels, didn't escalate tone, didn't match volume. He repeated the same line with the same cadence. Paperwork first, address confirmation first, supervisor first, because he understood something most people don't at 1 in the morning under blinding lights. Movement becomes thread in someone else's report. The team had numbers, vehicles, and posture, but Ethan had the threshold, the cameras, and discipline. And discipline is slower than adrenaline but stronger in the long run. The lead agent tried pushing again, stepping closer to the porch but stopping short of the steps. "Sir, failure to comply will escalate this situation." And Ethan answered without flinch. Failure to verify escalated it already. Not loud, not aggressive, just steady. Maya continued calmly narrating identifiers she could see. Partial plate numbers, unit markings, physical descriptions, not as a threat, not as drama, but as time-stamped reality. 15 minutes earlier, the street had been silent. Now it felt like a perimeter exercise stage for the wrong audience. And that was the problem. Wrong audience, wrong address. The supervisor's SUV arrived with less urgency and more control, parking behind the initial units instead of angling forward, and the tone shifted immediately from command to inquiry. "Why hasn't he exited?" the supervisor asked, and the lead agent replied with a version that framed caution as resistance. Ethan didn't step forward when the new voice spoke, didn't attempt to capitalize on it. He simply restated his requirement. Warrant on camera. Confirm the address. And only after the supervisor stepped into view and signaled for calm did Ethan add the piece of information he had intentionally withheld, not for intimidation but for context. "I'm a retired U.S. Navy SEAL." And the words didn't carry bravado, they carried implication, that he understood perimeter tactics, understood escalation curves, understood how quickly misunderstandings turn permanent. The supervisor's posture tightened slightly, liability recalculating in real time. "Credentials?" he asked, and Ethan answered carefully. I will present them slowly once the warrant is displayed and the address is confirmed, because credentials without structure can create more tension than they relieve. There was a pause, radio chatter low but urgent, and then the supervisor gave the instruction that should have come first: display the warrant. And for the first time since the lights hit, the lead agent hesitated. The paper came out, but not immediately into full view, angled at first, then lifted higher when the supervisor gestured. Higher. On camera, and Maya adjusted the doorbell feed to capture it clearly. Ethan didn't lower his hands, didn't step forward to inspect it himself. He relied on distance and documentation, because that was the whole point. Forced the verification into the open. The supervisor read the address aloud, and even before the final number left his mouth, Ethan knew it wouldn't match, because if it had, the hesitation wouldn't have been there. Floodlights hummed, radios crackled, and the air felt suddenly thinner as the supervisor read the address a second time, slower now, comparing it to the brass numbers mounted beside Ethan's door. No one moved for a full second after that. Not Ethan, not Maya, not the agents holding position along the lawn, because everyone understood at once that this operation, built on posture and urgency, was aimed at the wrong house. And the only reason it hadn't gone further was because the man in the doorway refused to move faster than the paperwork. The moment the supervisor finished reading the address aloud and the numbers didn't match the brass digits beside Ethan Walker's door, the entire operation began to lose oxygen, not all at once, but in subtle shifts, shoulders lowering, rifles dipping half an inch, voices dropping from command volume to conference tone. And you could hear it in the lead agent's first attempt to regain footing. There may be a discrepancy, he said, as if the word discrepancy could soften the reality that 3 SUVs, a perimeter stance, and repeated exit commands had been directed at the wrong residence. Ethan didn't lower his hands yet, didn't step forward to argue or gloat. He simply answered in the same calm cadence he had used from the beginning. That warrant does not authorize activity at this address. Please acknowledge that on record. And the phrasing mattered because it forced clarity instead of retreat language. While inside the foyer, Maya adjusted the camera angle slightly and repeated, steady and audible. Recording is active. Address mismatch confirmed at 1:19 a.m. Not dramatic, not emotional, just timestamp fact. The supervisor stepped closer to the document, double-checking street name, house number, zip code, and you could see the mental recalculation happening in real time. How had the verification failed? Who signed off? Who gave the green light to roll heavy before confirming? While the lead agent keyed his radio and spoke in shorter, less confident bursts, the urgency gone from his tone, replaced with something closer to damage control. The perimeter posture began to unravel. Agents along the side yard shifting weight backward instead of forward. One vehicle cutting its engine, another turning off high beams, but leaving parking lights on as if unsure whether to fully disengage or hold position. Ethan finally lowered his hands slowly, but remained in the doorway, not stepping onto the porch, not surrendering the threshold that had kept the entire interaction procedural instead of physical. And he said, "Before anyone leaves, I need the lead agent's name, badge number, supervisor's name, and the incident reference tied to this attempted warrant service." And that's when the last grasp at control surfaced, the lead agent responding sharply. "You don't have the authority to demand that information." But Ethan didn't argue rights in circles. He redirected to the supervisor. "I am formally requesting identifiers for documentation purposes." And the supervisor, understanding the optics and the recording, nodded slightly and began providing his own name and badge number first, modeling compliance with policy even as the lead agent hesitated. Maya quietly called out visible plate numbers from the vehicles and unit markings stitched on vests, ensuring that even if words were withheld, visuals were preserved. And the shift from tactical operation to administrative extraction became unmistakable as one of the SUVs reversed slightly to clear the driveway angle it had aggressively claimed minutes earlier. The supervisor spoke into his radio again, voice measured now, "Stand down. Address verification issue. Disengaging." And the phrasing was careful. Not wrong house, not error, just issue. But everyone present understood what it meant. Ethan kept the interaction anchored. "Please confirm on record that this residence is not listed on the warrant." And after a brief pause, the supervisor did exactly that, reading the authorized address once more and stating clearly that it did not correspond to the Walker property, which created the clean break Ethan had been building toward since the first command to exit. The lead agent avoided eye contact, shifting attention to logistics, signaling personnel to move vehicles back toward the street, trying to compress 15 minutes of escalation into a quiet withdrawal. But Ethan added one final safeguard: incident number, and after another reluctant beat, the supervisor provided it, along with the field office contact. For follow-up, because once video exists, refusal compounds liability. Engines restarted, floodlights dimmed in stages rather than all at once, and the cul-de-sac slowly returned to something resembling normal night lighting. Though the energy lingered like static, Ethan did not step fully outside until the final SUV rolled past the stop sign at the end of the street. And even then he remained on the porch rather than the driveway, scanning calmly, not for threat, but for confirmation that the perimeter had dissolved completely. Inside, the house felt both quiet and charged, and without celebration or raised voices, Ethan and Maya transitioned immediately from encounter mode to documentation mode, because they both understood that what happens after the lights leave often matters more than what happens under them. Ethan secured the door, then went straight to the security console, exporting footage from every exterior camera and the doorbell unit onto 2 separate drives, labeling each file with precise timestamps while the sequence was still fresh in his mind. Vehicle arrival 1:07 a.m., first verbal command 1:08, supervisor arrival 1:16, warrant displayed 1:18, address mismatch confirmed 1:19, disengagement initiated 1:22, because timelines written immediately read like evidence, not reconstruction. Maya compiled her own notes simultaneously, documenting plate numbers, physical descriptions, the specific phrases used to label lawful requests as noncompliance, and the moment the word discrepancy replaced command language, creating parallel records that reinforced each other. Ethan drafted a written summary before adrenaline fully faded, careful to separate observation from interpretation, listing exactly what was said, who said it, and in what order, because sequence determines accountability. By 2:03 a.m., backups were stored in 3 locations: one off-site via secure cloud upload, one on an encrypted drive, one on a secondary internal device, redundancy. Not out of paranoia, but out of habit learned from years where documentation meant survival. And as the house finally settled back into silence, the reality crystallized. The only reason the night ended with paperwork instead of panic was because movement had been replaced with discipline. And the only reason the operation retreated without rewriting itself was because every critical moment had been forced into the light before anyone had the chance to turn it off. By sunrise, what had started as a midnight perimeter was no longer a tense memory. It was a structured case file. And that shift from emotion to evidence is where the real consequences began. Ethan Walker didn't wait for an apology that might never come, and he didn't assume the agency would preserve the details the same way he would. At 7:42 a.m., he began drafting formal records requests, not as complaints fueled by anger, but as procedural triggers designed to create tracking numbers and audit trails, dispatch logs from the exact time window of the approach, body camera activation records for every agent on scene, radio traffic transcripts, the full warrant copy including supporting affidavit pages, supervisor call-in documentation, operational planning notes, and any address verification checklist that was supposed to precede a residential action. Because in operations, whether military or federal, the difference between a mistake and negligence is often documented in the preparation phase. Maya compiled a synchronized folder of their own materials, labeling video clips by event marker, exit command before warrant, supervisor arrival, warrant display, address mismatch acknowledged, identifier request, creating a parallel timeline that aligned perfectly with Ethan's written summary. And together they turned what could have been dismissed as confusion into a mapped sequence that left very little room for reinterpretation. The agency's first response arrived in careful language, describing the event as an address verification error during a time-sensitive operation, and emphasizing that no forced entry occurred, as if absence of physical damage erased the presence of armed pressure under floodlights at 1 in the morning. But what that response didn't account for was the clarity of synchronized video, because the footage showed vehicles establishing a perimeter before confirmation, showed repeated refusal to display documentation upon lawful request, showed the labeling of procedural caution as obstruction, and showed the immediate pivot in tone the second the wrong address became undeniable. Internal review, once triggered by formal complaint and records demand, became less about optics and more about sequence, and sequence is difficult to argue with when timestamps align across multiple camera angles. Investigators compared body camera logs to dispatch audio, and what they found created friction, activation gaps during the first minutes of the approach, radio shorthand indicating assumption rather than verification, and no recorded verbal confirmation of the Walker address prior to perimeter establishment, and that absence mattered as much as any statement. The supervisor's conduct separated itself under scrutiny, with documentation reflecting that verification and de-escalation began only after his arrival. But the lead agent's decision-making sat at the center of review, particularly the insistence on occupant exit before warrant display and the attempt to disengage without creating a formal incident reference until pressed. As the review widened, policy language was pulled, cross-referenced against conduct, and the gap between required address confirmation and actual on-scene behavior became impossible to ignore, especially with clear video demonstrating the timeline. What transformed the situation from internal correction to institutional exposure was not just the address error, but the escalation posture attached to it. Because an incorrect knock handled calmly is one thing, an armed perimeter demanding compliance before verification is another entirely. Civil counsel entered the picture soon after, not with theatrical announcements, but with documented filings referencing emotional distress, reputational harm, and the inherent risk created by tactical positioning at the wrong residence. And the agency, now operating under the weight of synchronized video and formal complaint channels, shifted from dismissive reassurance to structured negotiation. The settlement discussions were less about spectacle and more about liability calculus. How much exposure exists when recorded evidence demonstrates deviation from verification protocol? How juries respond to visual timelines versus written summaries? How policy gaps appear when illuminated by real-time footage? And those conversations, conducted in conference rooms far from Clearwater Ridge, moved steadily toward resolution. Disciplinary outcomes followed internally, including suspension tied to procedural violations and mandatory retraining directives emphasizing documented address confirmation prior to residential perimeter establishment, and policy revisions were quietly circulated mandating on-record verification of warrant addresses before exterior commands are issued, compulsory display of documentation upon resident request absent exigent circumstances, and supervisor confirmation before escalation posture is adopted at night operations. Changes framed as clarifications rather than corrections, but understood by those involved as direct responses to a single recorded sequence. When the settlement finalized, the figure reflected not just a wrong house, but the risk profile of how it was handled. And though the agency avoided dramatic public admission, the documentation trail ensured that the lesson existed in writing, archived, and referenced. Ethan and Maya did not treat the outcome as victory over individuals. Nor did they seek headlines, because their objective from the first command had never been confrontation. It had been control of narrative through discipline, and what lingered most from that night wasn't the glare of floodlights, but the realization that calm, recorded boundaries can outlast authority driven by momentum. The cul-de-sac returned to ordinary evenings, neighbors unaware of how close confusion had come to catastrophe, and the Walker home remained unchanged physically, yet fundamentally altered in understanding. A reminder etched not in damage but in documentation. And if there was a final takeaway, it was this: pressure without verification creates risk, but composure under pressure creates record, and record, when preserved carefully, has a way of reshaping outcomes long after the engines fade and the street goes quiet again.